Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats at this time. Our program will begin momentarily. Again, please take your seats at this time. Our program will begin momentarily.
Hello? It's working? All right. Hi, everybody. Okay, thank you. Well, welcome, everybody. This is quite a gathering. In Julie Gio's words, this is a dream gathering. If we're going to get together and change what's going on in pediatric cancers, this is quite a gathering. My name is Michael Copley, and I'm a pediatric leukemia dad, along with my wife, Liz. Hi, Liz. And for the past, I'd say 23 years, I've been volunteering with the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. More recently, I chaired its Beat AML campaign and the Master Clinical Trial, and most recently worked with Julie on Target Pediatric AML. I'd like to thank the Leukemia Lymphoma Society and its staff for helping to put this together. I'd also like to thank the doctors here today who are volunteering their time to design this children's initiative and who are here today to share with you some of its vision and strategy. And I'd like to really thank the foundations and the families here for what you guys are doing out there in this pediatric cancer world. We've all traveled our different journeys to get here today. And we have insights, we have wisdom, we have observations, and I'm sure we have ideas. And I hope throughout today and this evening we have time to share those. So in the next 2 very quick hours, we're going to kind of have a working session around the Children's Initiative, its vision, its strategy. The lead doctors are going to share their thoughts with you. Then we're going to have questions and discussion. And then of course, Julie, where are you? Julie Gio? Julie will be sharing too. And Julie is really the driver behind this meeting. And in her words, it really is a dream gathering. So we'll try to quit around 5 o'clock and move to another room where we'll have a panel and more information on the Children's Inspiration Campaign. And then around 7 or 7:15, there's a cocktail reception. And I'm sure we'll all be ready for that after a few hours. All right, with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gwen Nichols. She's the Chief Medical Officer at the Leukemia Lymphoma Society and chairs with Andy Kolb the Children's Initiative. Quick little story. Liz and I met Gwen in Washington, D.C. about 2.5 years ago, and we descended upon Gwen. And after introducing ourselves, we said, Gwen, we need pediatrics at LLS. And I didn't say it, but she saw it in my eyes. I meant we need it tomorrow. And kindly and nicely, she said, Michael, we'll get there, but it's a little more complicated than you think. But what Gwen has done in the past 2.5 years is amazing. I admire her for what she's done. And so here's Gwen Nichols. All right.
Michael, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for making the effort to be here and spending the afternoon with us. I want to try and tell you a little bit about, and am I able to move mine? About what we hope to accomplish today. Or the keyboard. Okay. So first I want to just have some thinking with you about why we want you here. This is not just for us to be spouting to you about what we're doing. We'd really like to understand your thoughts, get your feedback, get questions, ideas, so that if we're not doing things the right way, we figure it out early in the game and not 5 years down the road. And in this room, we have a lot of collective wisdom. And so I'm really excited to figure out how we might be able to have all of you partner with us. And that can mean many, many different things. But we'd like to have your support in what we're doing. And some of that is using your brains to help us do it the right way. So this is the little bit of LLS pitch. LLS was founded in 1949, actually by parents who lost their child to leukemia. Their son was 16 years old. And they founded this then to do research and help patients in need. And hopefully many of you know, thank you. that we have not only research, but patient services, education, travel assistance, clinical trial navigation, copay assistance, advocacy for children as well as adults as part of our mission. And also, you've heard in 2016, Michael was the key leader for our Beat AML Master Trial, which is a clinical trial for adults over the age of 60, which is the peak of AML incidence, with poor prognosis acute leukemia. And so these are folks who have less than a 25% chance of 5-year survival. So it's actually a pretty bad prognosis, and that's why we started there. Beat AML, LLS is the sponsor of the trial, so we've developed through this relationships with the FDA, pharmaceutical partners, and other foundations to try a novel clinical trial design, that puts the patient at the center. So the patient can have choices of therapy based on the best therapy for them. So we realized, and Michael and Julie in particular, and actually Sohail also, were very instrumental in urging us to think about pediatrics as a master trial, and why weren't we doing that? And so I want to tell you about what we've done to scope out what the similarities and differences are. The LLS board was prepared for us to do a Beat AML master trial for kids. But I have been extending that and extending that and extending that because I realize we need to do a completely different kind of trial when we're talking about kids. So I want to tell you a little bit about this with the understanding that we're starting with relapsed AML, and we think we will include some poor prognosis specific subsets of other acute leukemias within this trial because they may be target agnostic. But the model that we build, and this is why we really want you in the room to hear about it, I hope is going to be something that we learn from and that can be taken by other foundations and other groups and utilized for other children's cancers and in fact other rare cancers. And I'm excited to tell you what I think are the issues. And then of course what we're hoping to do about it. So only a handful of drugs have been approved for the first instance in children with cancer, and I don't think I need to tell this audience that. You know that labeling of the drugs in oncology anyway for kids is extremely rare. And so most pediatric oncologists are left to treat patients off-label. And because the trials take a long time to complete and we don't have outcome targets for new drugs, we end up with saying, when you look at a subgroup of kids with AML, we end up saying, well, you know, you need to hit a target somewhere between 35 and 80% response rate. Pharma can't design an appropriate trial with those wide margins, not without thousands of patients, and that defeats the purpose. We'll never get forward that way. So we know we have to do better, and we know we can't do it by ourselves. So our solution to this is what we're calling the Children's Initiative. And I want to, I don't know if I clicked it, there we go. So the part that we're going to spend the most time talking about today is the bottom part, which is the pediatric master trial. But we also have expanded our research. We're going to be doing approximately $20 million of additional children-specific blood cancer research. We have started to be a greater force in the advocacy world to partner with all of you to advocate together for children. in Washington and in the States, and we have support for caregivers, and we're also working with you to figure out what else can we expand to make sure our support is appropriate for children. But we're all going to talk about this master trial, and I'll tell you why that's important. Roadblocks. So, I've already gone too far. Hopefully it'll show up in a second. But pediatric cancers are rare diseases, so the drug development paradigm is inefficient and costly. You need hundreds of sites to get enough patients to answer a scientific question in the fashion that we need it answered. And the regulations vary between the US and Europe, so a pharma company will look at potential pediatric development and say, we have to do two completely separate trials, one in Europe and one in the US, because the regulations are different. It doubles the cost, and it doesn't provide double the benefit. So we know in this trial we need international collaboration, and that'll allow us to have much faster accrual of the appropriate patients. And we're working with the regulators both in the US and in Europe to try and allow this platform to meet the regulatory requirements. A second roadblock, and it's not moving. Yeah. Now we're on this. Am I not pointing it at the right thing? Okay. Well, we're one behind me already. Anyway, the pictures are not all that great. I stole them. A separate trial for each agent, the one drug at a time model for clinical trials, is inefficient. And it puts the drug at the center of the development paradigm instead of the patient at the center of the development paradigm. So it means that drug companies need to screen, especially for precision medicine, need to screen a huge number of patients to find the patient that they need for that precision model. And so it goes against developing precision medicines, right? But if you change it around and have a master trial where you have multiple drugs with the patient getting to be moved to whichever drug is appropriate, it's efficient. Okay, thanks. It's efficient. If you could move me too, that would be great. Maybe not. Anyway, every time, if the patient gets the choice of different arms, every patient that you screen can be treated on somebody's trial, right? And so you aren't screening 10 and putting one patient on a trial. You're screening 10 and putting them on 10 different trials. Eventually, that becomes a great efficiency, and every child screened should have a precision option for therapy in relapse. So another roadblock is that precision medicine progress that we're really proud of that we've made in adult leukemia is not seen in childhood leukemia, and one of the reasons is that children are not little adults. The biology is different. And so the cost benefit of developing a precision medicine for a pediatric specific indication will never be positive, and we all have to just face that. It will never be a positive business case. And I know many of you are business people. You have to understand there isn't a way that you can do the clinical trials and make it cost effective. It's always going to be a loss. And so we need to figure out, and that's a financial loss. It would be an immense societal win, right? But a loss financially. And so that system leads to development in pediatrics only of agents that are already being sold for adults. and then we can test them in kids. And that's wrong for about 2/3 of the agents, right? So there may be 1/3 overlap. So we have to be thinking differently. So we hope that the LLS PEDAL trial will ensure dedicated therapies and dedicated research to finding precision therapies for children that are specific to their biology, and that we can engage pharma to do the right thing because we'll help them with the pieces that get them there. And then the final roadblock is that data is siloed, and not every child has access to sequencing. So there are a lot of different, very good institutions, collaborations, and countries around the world that are doing amazing research and sequencing. But it's not uniformly performed, and it's not always annotated with clinical data. And so consolidating that and learning and sharing it is critical for this. And so an open source data commons will consolidate pediatric leukemia data from multiple institutions and build a common language so that we're all talking about the same thing. And we want to make that data set available to researchers and clinicians worldwide. That's the goal. Anyone participating in this should have access to it so that we can all learn, because we don't know where the next great discovery will come from. So thank you. Collaboration is critical for success of PEDAL, and we hope it'll be a model for the future. We want to share the good and the bad of what we learn, and we want your input. LLS is a convener, but the pediatric community needs to give us feedback and help us understand how we can work together to bypass the roadblocks I've told you about. You have knowledge and experience that we want to learn from, so please help us be successful. And let me, before I bring Andy up, I want to tell you that we have actually a fairly large number of people who are watching this and listening to it remotely because they weren't coming to Atlanta. And so we have a live stream, and we have Stacy here. Stacy Elgin is our live stream facilitator. So she will also be chiming in if there are questions from people who are remote. What we'd like to do, if it's okay with everyone, is as we go through, each person speaking will stop and answer questions about what they talked about, and then we hope we'll get through the technical part relatively rapidly so we can sit and actually have a conversation with you and do question and answer back and forth, at least for the second hour, if not longer. So if your question is not answered during the time, there will be lots more time. So please take notes. We've given you pens and notebooks if there are things, if you have a burning question that somehow we didn't get to, have no fear. There's lots more time to talk, and we really look forward to it. And now I really would like to welcome Andy Kolb, my partner in crime and really incredibly dedicated collaborator on this initiative.
Thanks, Gwen. And I want to thank all of you for being here today, giving your time and your support to this effort. We really can't do what we do without help from our community of donors and supporters. So thank you for being here, and thank you for listening, and thank you in advance for your questions and support. It's working now? All right. So, but before I start, I want to highlight or call out a couple people who are in the room. Mixed in the group are some scientists that are trying to remain anonymous, so I'm going to highlight and put a spotlight on them. You'll meet everybody at this front table, but at the table over here is Todd Druley, who's the Chief Medical Officer at Archer and a pediatric oncologist at Washington University. Next to him is Sarah Tajian, who is a pediatric oncologist at CHOP, and she's really an expert in cellular therapies as well as leukemias. And then Brenda Weigel is a pediatric oncologist at the University of Minnesota. She leads the Pediatric Evaluation Early Phase Clinical Trials Network, new name, I'm just starting to get it under my belt, through CTEP. And Brenda flew in just for this afternoon to be part of this event, so thank you, Brenda, for being here. Who else is hiding? So in the back table is Brian and Monica. They work with Sam and are part of the informatics structure at the University of Chicago. And then finally, Malcolm Smith, also at that table, is the Associate Branch Chief for Pediatric Oncology at the Cancer Therapeutics Evaluation Program at CTEP, or at the NCI. So thank you all for being here, and it's a really extraordinary group of people. If you have questions, they should extend beyond this front table and include that group as well. So Gwen made the case, or started to make the case, of why we have to do better. And I think that we all know that relapsed leukemias are relapse in leukemia is still a significant problem for us to address. And that the model that we've used in the past, which is to use drugs that are developed largely for adult indications, getting back to those market forces that Gwen talked about, the market driving drug development are adult cancers, and trying to repurpose those drugs for pediatric development has gotten us to the point we're at now, but it's not going to get us much farther. We really need to recognize the fact that children and adults have profoundly dissimilar causes of their cancers and need novel therapeutics. But in the last 20 years as a pediatric oncologist for me, I don't think I've seen a time where our knowledge about potential targets, the number of therapeutics that are out there, has never been like this before. This is really a crucial time in drug development because we have this knowledge, because we have more drugs available to us than we ever had before. And the regulatory environment is shifting as well with the RACE Act and other federal regulations. We have a window of opportunity to test these drugs in kids, to develop these drugs in kids. Pharmaceutical partners have a very short attention span, driven by forces that are unrelated to our mission. So we have to get in on this now. We have to have the ability to meet the needs of the pharmaceutical companies and balance them against the academic demands of a clinical trial and the needs of the patient and the missions that we all serve to that end. So I think this is a unique time, and it is hitting, the PEDAL initiative is hitting at just the right moment where I think we can have a profound impact and change the paradigm of drug testing for kids with leukemia. This is, I'm going to show a couple graphs like this. We're looking at, on the y-axis, percentage of kids that are surviving with different types of cancer, and on the x-axis, the years. So you can see just over the last 30 years, there's been a significant improvement in survival in many pediatric cancers. The green line at the bottom is AML. I think AML has long lagged behind other malignancies. It's not alone in that lag, but it certainly stands out among those on the list here. And I think the other problem that we see on this curve, and I'll pull out ALL and AML, ALL in black and AML in red, is that we're seeing a plateau over the last 20 years. And this gets back to the point that I was trying to make before, that we've probably gotten as much mileage as we can out of the repurposing of drugs that were built for adults. And in the case of ALL, we have been very successful in identifying kids that need more therapy and kids that need less therapy. We've been very successful in identifying specific subsets that can respond to targeted therapies. There's a lot more work to do, but we have been successful to that end. In AML, we've plateaued despite giving maximally intensive therapy. We have 3 or 4 tools in our toolbox, and they're all sledgehammers, and that's about all we can do for pediatric AML at this time. In both of these diseases, there's a critical need. More children relapse with ALL than any other disease, childhood cancer. ALL is still one of the leading causes of death among children with cancer. In AML, we've run out of room in how we can develop new therapies that we can bring to the table, because we've already pushed the intensity to the point of tolerance. So if we're going to make a difference, if we're going to drive these curves further towards 100%, we need a new paradigm. We need new therapies that are developed specifically for these kids. And I'm going to give an example of, and I stole these slides from Peter Adamson, who you'll hear from later, I think, via video. I want to give a couple examples of how drug development works and doesn't work in pediatrics. These are two drugs, inotuzumab ozogamicin and gemtuzumab ozogamicin. They're both antibodies targeting leukemia-specific proteins, and they can be very effective in the treatment of ALL and AML, respectively. The first paper that described benefit in patients receiving inotuzumab was published in June of 2011. The FDA gave it breakthrough designation 4 years later. The first kid enrolled on a trial with a regulatory intent was 6 years after that. So the drug was first noted to be effective in 2011. The first kid got access to this drug 6 years later. Gemtuzumab is a slightly more striking story. The first trial that showed benefit was in 1999. And then in the pediatric development, we did things right. We had completed a phase 1 and a phase 2 and enrolled patients on a phase 3 within 5 years of that initial patient. The drug was not approved for pediatrics until 2017, so 18 years after it first showed benefit, and about 15 years after the first child was treated. And that FDA label indication extends only to a rare subgroup of patients with AML. Though we know it benefits many, it's only FDA approved for a few. And this is not anybody's fault. Pediatric drug development is a partnership between industry, between academia, between regulatory authorities. And I think when we look at the examples of inotuzumab and gemtuzumab, everybody in this group here owns a part of these delays and owns a part of the challenges to access that pediatric patients have for new drugs. But the key is that this really is a systems failure. And getting back to the urgency of what we need to do, the fact that we have new drugs, more targets, and more regulatory incentive than ever before, we really need to fix this fundamental problem. As Gwen said, when we put drugs at the center when the drugs are driving the development, we're going to see delays and we're going to see limited access to new therapies. We need to make sure that it's the patient at the center of drug development. And to do that, that's one of the missions behind PEDAL, is that we are going to insert LLS in the center of this wheel and help drive this system for more efficient drug development, to get drugs into kids more quickly. There are a lot of barriers between academia and industry and our regulators and our funders. There's a lot of issues that we need to work through, but we've got a great group of people here that are up to the challenge and excited to figure out how we can do this better. So at the core, PEDAL is it's a master trial. We want to collect all data on all patients. We want children to have data that extends across the life of their disease, not just the life of the clinical trial that they're enrolled on. We want to have a central screening protocol to make sure that we have efficient access. And again, the patient is at the center of drug development, not the drug. And I'm going to keep using that, Gwen. I'll credit you whenever I remember to. And this is going to be a hybrid design so that we are able to use some of the tremendous efficiencies created by the National Cancer Institute, as well as the resources from pharmaceutical partners, to do this as efficiently and as quickly and as cost effectively as possible. This is a global collaborative, as Gwen mentioned. We really need to make sure that, especially for some of these rare subsets, that we have international collaboration and cooperation, that we use international data standards so that a child who's treated in Atlanta we're recording the exact same data as if they were treated in Amsterdam or Germany or wherever that might be. And again, I think we're at an inflection point in drug development. We are seeing more therapies, cellular therapies, immunotherapies, small molecule therapies coming into the clinic at a much more rapid pace. And we need the academic community needs to be ready to receive these drugs and test them as quickly and as efficiently as possible. I think the window for individual drugs is limited, and we have to be ready for them. And that was it for my presentation. So thank you very much. Again, thank you all for being here today. And let me pause and see if there are any questions in the room before I bring Todd up. Anybody online? Stacy?
Not at this point, but we can encourage anyone online if they want to ask any questions. All you have to do is just simply type it in, and we'll be glad to get an answer for you. To anyone online, if they can help us out, or anyone else in the audience, if you have a question, you have a microphone there in the center of your table.
All right, well, let me bring Todd up. So Todd is leading our clinical trial development. Todd's at Seattle Children's Hospital and is a pediatric oncologist with specialization in leukemia. He's also leading our next phase 3 study in the Children's Oncology Group. So Todd is really a master of all things related to clinical trials. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andy. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody here. I am absolutely honored and humbled to be here. It is really a special initiative and a potentially transformative initiative. And what I'd like to do over the next 5-10 minutes is really to discuss what the trial in very broad strokes might look like. And before I do that, just to put all this in context and kind of how I got here and my experience with all these barriers is that, I trained, I'm a product of my training, and my training was at MD Anderson Cancer Center. And if anybody knows what that is, it's basically an entire city all dedicated towards treating cancer. It's an amazing place. And it was something that inspired me, and I was so into it as a trainee. And I just saw all these new drugs and all this incredible science happening, and pharma coming in and saying, we want to test our new drug on all these patients, but that was the adult patients. And I made it my goal to try and bring those incredible drugs as quickly as I could to kids and offer them hope. And some of the roadblocks that both Gwen and Andy have talked about, I've lived them. There have been successes. We have brought some drugs forward, but there's just some factors out there that don't make putting these drugs into children the priority. And what this is doing is it's going to make that a priority, really for the first time since I've been doing this, and that's why I'm so excited and really humbled to be a part of it. So what I'd like to do is just spend a couple of minutes giving broad strokes as to what this initiative, this incredible initiative is. And as both Andy and Gwen mentioned, this is the first, in my experience at least, the first comprehensive international, which is incredibly important, study that will prospectively and systematically collect vital information and treat people prospectively with children with relapsed leukemia. The trial will enroll children with relapsed leukemia with the purpose of determining eligibility for precision medicine trials, which I'll get into in a second. And also, because this is such an amazing and broad initiative, both nationally and internationally, this is going to help us learn through accrual of patients. as Andy mentioned, there's lots of subgroups that are all trying to do the same thing. And what we hope this will do is bring everybody together, all with a singular purpose of improving cure rates for children with AML. With acute leukemia. And then finally, and really most importantly, in my opinion, is to identify biologic targets and to provide discovery moving forward for the next generation of new drugs. So this is the 50,000-foot view. I don't know if this has a pointer on it, but what I'll do is I'll just walk you through this. And again, as Gwen mentioned, this is a stolen schema, which I really happen to love, which is, again, the 50,000-foot view of the master screening trial. So on your left, you see the stick figures that represent children. The top is children with newly diagnosed AML. All children in the United States, through the Children's Oncology Group, are offered participation on a trial called Project Every Child. And what that Project Every Child does is it collects information and it collects blood samples on patients. And what we would like to do is to collect that information prospectively moving forward and help inform this initiative. And something that many of you in this room have done to make this even possible is the genomic sequencing of every child with AML and hopefully ALL in the future, so that we can prospectively identify the genetic abnormalities moving forward. And we all pray, of course, that these children are all cured, but if they're not, we'll have that information at the time of relapse. The children with relapse AML can enroll on this PETAL initiative, and you can see that here. And all that in the red above, and this is where Sam, who's going to talk to you in a few minutes, comes in. But all that information is collected, and all that information is going to be used to determine eligibility for a number of trials, which on the far right you see subtrial 1, subtrial 2, subtrial 3. Those will all be LLS-sponsored subclinical trials for which the eligibility is determined even at diagnosis and also at relapse by sequencing these patients. So if they express a certain target and we have the availability of that drug for that target, those patients will be treated with it. And the fact that this is such a broad initiative, that really makes this feasible. It's really hard to do in a single institution. It's really even hard to do in a single consortium. But when you're doing this nationally and internationally, you're finally able to learn more about the drug biologically, and you're able to learn more about the drug clinically to really have a statistical power to assess whether or not it's going to work. We also plan on, through this eligibility mechanism that Sam will discuss called Gearbox, we'll also, it will provide a recommendation for a clinical trial that might not be a Leukemia Lymphoma Society subtrial. So we're collecting all that information moving forward. So how is this going to overcome these barriers? And I've listed a few of these here. Number one, we're hoping to streamline protocol development, and as part of that, we have leaders both from regulatory bodies and others that are going to be a part of reviewing these studies early on. Right now, this is very piecemeal from regulatory body to regulatory body. Number two, we're going to engage industry. And how are we going to engage industry? Through LLS's help, number one. And number two, we have to be able to deliver them what they need to get their drug approved. And those deliverables include a safety signal, an efficacy signal, and that data needs to be collected in a way that is going to get them that approval. And that is something that the power of this LLS PETAL initiative is going to deliver to industry. It's going to bring industry in, and therefore more therapies will be available to the children that need it. Again, we're going to have increased accrual because this is going to be open nationally and internationally. This should help us understand not only relapse leukemia as a whole, but these rare subsets. So these MLL rearranged AMLs, et cetera, we'll really be able to understand them both biologically and with more clinical trial power. And again, this is something that industry wants too. They want to be able to deliver to the regulatory authorities information that's going to help get their drug approved, and the best way to do it is to be able to accrue more patients more quickly. And finally, as I've said, I consider to be the most important part of this is we're going to improve outcomes through innovation. So Hale, who you will hear from in a sec, is a world leader in AML biology and has been one of the main scientists that has finally proven to the world that pediatric AML is different than adult AML. And how did he do that? He did that through an initiative through the NCI, through the Children's Oncology Group, where there was initial data that would sequence patients and give us some answers, and now we're doing that thanks to you guys on a much larger scale. We're going to have the opportunity for creative clinical trial designs. We hope us in academia will be able to help formulate these clinical trial designs in partnership with pharma so that we can get these drugs approved more quickly. And then again, we'll have rare samples that we can learn more about so that it'll help more and more kids. And so that's an overview of what this trial is. And again, this means so much to me personally. I see patient families out in the audience that I've helped to take care of and that I've felt incredibly helpless not to be able to deliver them the cures that they've needed. And you know, from a personal level, that's incredibly difficult. But I'm going to dedicate myself to this and my career to this so that we can move this forward and help more kids. Thanks very much. Yes,
The question,
please, yeah.
what was the rationale for focusing on the relapse instead of newly diagnosed? Because your chart showed the population newly diagnosed significantly larger than relapse. I would have thought that that would have been a much more appropriate target.
Yeah, that's an outstanding question. And so first of all, let me say that we are going to be including patients that are refractory to upfront therapy, so that are not, that doesn't answer your question, but I did want to include that. You know, patients that we know are difficult to treat and that haven't responded the way we want them to respond will be included in this. A lot of that, the answer to your question really is to be able to assess a new drug. Really, the process is to give it in children that relapse. And really, one of the main reasons is if you have a survival rate of, say, 70%, sometimes, and in some groups even higher, it's often hard to justify to ourselves sometimes, and certainly to pharma and to regulatory authorities, that a drug that has never been in a child is going to be okay to put in a child, where we don't know if it even adds any benefit. We don't completely understand the safety of the drug. So it's really a risk-benefit kind of thing. Now, what we hope is if we see safety and if we see it working, that it moves up into upfront patients as quickly as possible. And that's that timeline that we're trying to shrink. But that's an actually excellent question. Yeah. Okay. So Hale Mashinchi, also from Seattle at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, like I said, world leader in childhood AML biology, is going to talk to you next.
Thank you, Todd, and it's a pleasure to be here. My role in the Children's Initiative to lead target discovery and biomarker development. Just to step back and sort of provide a little bit of background on how we got here. It looks like there's a big delay between. Great. Although Children's Initiative will address both high-risk AML and ALL, both because of my expertise in AML, but also the fact that given the really large armamentarium of therapies for ALL, and the fact that there are very few therapies for AML, my presentation will focus on AML. So AML, although it's really quarter of all leukemias, it is one of the most aggressive leukemias there is. And actually, when you really look at the numbers, especially when you take into account that nearly quarter of survivors of AML go on to develop life-limiting or life-ending complications, including significant cardiac failure and such. It is really the leading cause of death from leukemia in children. And one thing that when we look back, I've started working on AML going back to 1997. I've been involved at every COG trial, 2961, 0531, 1031, and we were part of St. Jude trial. I've been involved with trials in Europe. I can tell you that of all these trials, COG has put 3,000, 3,500 patients in the last few years, in last 2 decades. There has not been a single trial that has shown any benefit to the experimental agent. So the way that you treat half the patient with standard of care and the other half with standard care plus one of the drugs that is supposed to cure all AML. That effort, that strategy has been a big failure. There has not been a single trial in the last 20 years that has shown any benefit to the experimental arm, overlapping curves. And the outcome improvement that we're showing you, there has been an improvement, but those are because of improved supportive care, and we really cannot take credit for better antibiotics. So what we are seeing is that our strategy to address treatments in AML has not been a success. So we really need to step back and see what can we do that can really change the paradigm. One of the things that we really do see is the fact that, these are, we really need to have can I just disconnect from this? Can you guys run it from there? Because there's the complete, what I see on the screen is not what I'm seeing up here. Okay. So what we are seeing is that, the figure that you're seeing, that's incidence rate for AML. So what you're seeing is that AML is really adult of elderly. So 80% of all AML that we have is seen in patients who are 60, 70, 80-year-olds. And as a result, almost all of the discoveries and therapeutic development has been done in that age group with the assumption that it's the same disease, it's just happening at a lower incidence. And anything that is developed in elderly can be simply moved to treating patients who are much younger, including infants. So one thing is that we have shown that the disease is drastically different. In fact, if there is a drug that's developed in elderly, it is highly likely that it will have very little utility, if any utility at all, in younger children. Actually, there is a new drug that was approved recently for IDH mutations, and the drug company wants us to do a pediatric trial. We went back and looked at the last 1,000 patients that were treated, and we have 6 patients which would qualify for that drug. As you can imagine, it's hard to run a trial that would take 5 years to accrue 6 patients. So, and vice versa, there are targets that are expressed in younger patients that are just not seen in elderly. So, and also you're sitting here, you're probably saying, well, it's kind of hard to imagine that it's the same disease that's in a 6-month-old as it is in an 85-year-old. So the idea of, these are just changing on their own. Are you guys changing it or am I? Okay. So, the novel targets really is a must. So mutations that we see in older adults is pretty rare in children. However, we do see actionable targets that is seen in younger patients that we can actually develop towards curative therapies. And also we need to develop biomarkers for new therapeutics, for diagnostic, for prognostic purposes, as well as for predictive biomarkers for monitoring patients more appropriately. Next slide. So part of our effort for therapeutic discovery really is to generate appropriate data to to be able to interrogate pediatric population, pediatric AML patients. So this is where target pediatric AML, this is a work that Julie and Michael spearheaded, and really an incredible cooperation between individuals and small foundations to put together resources to create the single largest genomic database ever in AML. And that is just not pediatrics, in all AML. We have nearly 3,000 patients have been sequenced, transcriptome sequencing, microRNA, mRNA sequencing, and recently NCI supported the whole genome sequencing to really complement that. So the question is, okay, now we have this discovery database, what do we do with it? How do we use this to identify appropriate targets? And probably the lowest hanging fruit is that those are there drugs out there that we can repurpose. And this is something that we had the big database, and we asked the question, let's go pull all the data, all the drugs that are out there, and see of those drugs, how many have targets expressed in pediatric AML. And I have a couple of examples in mesothelioma. This is a lung cancer biomarker that is actually, there's a drug out there, and we have a good number of AML patients that express it at high levels. So that is one that we're already moving forward as part of PEDAL. CD74 is a melanoma drug that we can incorporate. And frankly, as of 2 weeks ago, we had a list of about 200 antibody drug conjugates we look for the expression. There are 30 drugs out there that the target is expressed in at least 30% of the patients or higher. So we do have these drugs for repurpose. Doesn't matter for us what the drug was developed for, as long as drugs out there and the target is expressed. So theoretically, we have 20, 30 drugs that we can start looking into potentially incorporating. So that is the lowest hanging fruit of repurposing these drugs. The question that's a bigger issue is that can we identify and develop pediatric specific targets? So as far as identifying targets, we've already started doing that. We have put together a massive computational infrastructure that includes folks from NCI, from St. Jude, from Fred Hutch, to really interrogate this massive data. So we have a number of targets that we identified. And the plan is to actually take these targets through validation, through preclinical testing. The question becomes, can we bridge that gap to clinical development? Pharma, we cannot even get drug companies to give us the drugs for clinical trial, drugs that they already have in hand for us to run a clinical trial. So as you can imagine, the idea of developing a drug just for pediatric AML is not going to be financially attractive. So the question is that, can we bridge that gap? How can we bring these therapeutics that we can bring all the way to the verge of clinical trial into patients? And then we have actually put in place infrastructure and mechanism to transition some of these targets into therapeutics. We have Protein Science Lab collaboration that's really an outstanding resource for generating antibodies towards some of these agents, generating antibodies for ADC development, for BiTEs, as well as for CAR T. So we have the collaboration with Protein Science Lab, chemical biology labs that can actually make inhibitors for some of these targets. So all of those we have in place, a matter of resources and identifying targets to develop. So we also have, Dr. Stegmeyer is not here, but her role as a preclinical testing lead, whatever data that we generate and biomarkers that we develop, so some of those resources will be provided to her to take it through the preclinical testing to the verge of clinical development. Next slide. So regarding the biomarkers, what is a biomarker? Basically, it's an assay, a testing for various components that you can actually use for different purposes. A biomarker could be a target that you develop, identify for therapeutic purpose. The patient expresses gene X. As a result, we're going to put them on a drug, this particular drug. So this could be used for study entry as part of our master trial. Every patient will be screened, and once we identify a particular biomarker that matches with a drug, that patient would move into the appropriate treatment arm. It could be either flow cytometry based, RNA sequencing, DNA, basically could be really, biomarker can be anything. Regarding prognosis, we are putting in place particular assays to be able to predict what the outcome will be before we even put patients on a trial. So we can actually, based on expression of gene X or gene Y, we can predict that your outcome is going to be good or bad. And as a result, we can actually modify their path through the trial. One thing that we have not been able to do a good job is monitoring patients once you start trial. And we generally, we do marrows every so often looking for leukemia. The question is that, can you put in place appropriate novel assays with very high sensitivity to detect the leukemia emerging at a very, very low level so it can intervene before the florid relapse? And if it's sensitive and accurate enough, then you may be able to intervene before there is any evidence of leukemia. Frankly, we do it with some of our infectious disease, or actually with even acute promyelocytic leukemia. We are treating numbers for some of these. We're not treating disease anymore. As soon as the biomarker says that, there is a 1 in a million cell that's emerging, we can hit it. And so we're, instead of exposing patients to these toxic therapies, if we have a target to go after, we can actually eliminate that tiny clone before they emerge as a true leukemia. So the other thing that we've actually put resources, and this is with collaborating with some of the laboratories and investigators, to really have put together a functional assay to determine whether a patient's leukemia is appropriately sensitive to list of drugs, and as part of our path forward to selecting appropriate drugs. This is the early data has not been with a more conventional approach has not been that promising, but the next generation of these functional assays have really shown some promise to more appropriately predict response based on what we call ex vivo or test tube. So basically, that is sort of a combination of identifying targets, continuing our discovery. Our discovery never ends, and identifying appropriate biomarker for monitoring, for diagnosis, and for appropriate allocation. So that is the vision, is to identify targets that drive the leukemia and that leukemia is highly dependent on, and to be able to deliver therapy that will eliminate the causal root of the leukemia, and put appropriate tests and biomarker assays in place to be able to make that happen. So that's the end of my presentation. I don't know if there's any questions from the audience or from the online folks.
Curious, 2 questions. How much does it cost to do the mapping per patient? And how do we get insurance companies to pick up that for newly diagnosed so that doesn't come out of this budget? I feel like that money could be used for other things, possibly.
That's a great question. And frankly, the hope is that eventually insurance companies will pick it up. So for clinical sequencing, my hope is that once we establish that as an absolute necessity for managing patients, insurance company will pick it up. So I don't think the clinical sequencing is a non-ending that has to be supported, but for the time being, that's critical. So overall, the cost is a few $1,000s at most, and I think the prices are going to be dropping with there are more and more competition in the field. So I think that's one thing, is that there's a clinical sequencing piece, and then there's discovery sequencing, and because for clinical sequencing, it's going to be much more stringent what you put in it for limited number of genes. The discovery-based sequencing is going to be probably a little bit more, actually it's less costly overall, but much more comprehensive. So I think those are going to be occurring in parallel. So when we say clinical sequencing versus research-based sort of a discovery sequencing.
How do you know if your hospital in your area is putting, when they say they're doing clinical sequencing and all the work that they do, how do you know it's going into this bank? Because there's so many different places it goes. Like, how do you actually know they're putting it in the place where people can actually see it?
Well, generally, if local institution, when they do sequencing, it stays at patient's record. So unless it's stipulated that's going to be shared, it won't get there. And there are different types of sequencing. Some laboratories, they look at 4 genes, and that's what they're. So the main question is that making sure that the folks are sending the appropriate assays for sequencing. And from my standpoint, it doesn't really matter what platform you use, as long as it has at least a bare minimum of, 10, 15, 20, biomarkers that actually has. So that is something that I would actually specify. I'd ask families, like, what is it that you're calling sequencing? How many genes are involved and such.
So are you able to use past genomic testing that was done on relapsed patients and use that for this clinical trial as well?
Short answer is yes. We're actually going to be using that for initial entry into trial if we don't have that information available immediately. But we will also repeat the assay at time of entry, because we do know that some of these mutations change from diagnosis to relapse. One can enroll based on the previous genomic data, and with confirmation, it's possible that with the confirmatory test, we don't see the mutation and say, what, you may need to come off this arm and go to a different one. But overall, yes. Any online questions? No. Okay, thank you.
Okay, all right, so let's see where I am at here. Okay, so I always start with a picture of silos, and because this is the world that I live in, we think about the way we collect data and the way we do all of our work. We love to think that everything we do is shared widely throughout the world, and it's not. We had a call this morning with a major cancer center that is dying to share their data with us, and they can't, not because they don't want to, because there's regulation, there's lawyers, there's contracts, there's data use agreements, you name it. We have every excuse in the world for not sharing our data. We have to start sharing our data. And so the name of the game for all the work we do with LLS Petal and the Children's Initiative is about sharing our data, making it available for research and for care. So I love showing these slides because you would look at them and think, oh, they must be 50 years old, but they're not. The slide on the left is, there's 3 laptops, each one's hooked to a different pharmaceutical company's data collection system. You see the usernames and passwords taped to the front there. And these are so a research nurse or a research assistant can actually type the data in from one system into the other. In the middle, that's not an anachronism, that's an actual clinical trial binder holding data for one child for one cycle of their chemotherapy. You can see the handwriting, that's an adverse event note that I had to sign so that they could then fax in so they could keep track of it. And on the right, you can see the handwritten adverse event criteria that we keep track of. And the clipboard is emblematic of so many of our problems, as all of you who've gone to the doctor know, and you fill out the same form again and again and again. In the waiting room, do they ever even use those data that are on that clipboard? I mean, we need to be able to collect the data in a way that's shareable and that's usable. So this is a high-level overview of what we're building with our Petal infrastructure. And the point I want to make here is that we need to get away from these old paradigms of how we collect data. The old system of I'm going to open one screen and type it from one screen into the other, we have to get past that. So the name of the game for LLS Petal is we're going to collect data right from the source wherever we can. So of course we're going to get data from the COG, but we're not going to do that manually. We're going to hook into their systems and we're going to pull the data out, and we're going to pull data right from the sequencing partners, Foundation Medicine and others. We're going to pull data right from the cytogenetics reports. To the earlier question about how do we know somebody in one part of the country has the same data as the other, we're going to put standards in place and collect the data right from the source. And we're not going to rely on these manual interpretations of the data and the retyping of the data. We're going to pull all of it in automatically. So the point on this slide is just to say, listen, we understand that we are under certain constraints with manual collection of data, but we want to envision something brand new and exciting here, which is how we're going to collect data right from the place that it is sourced. So we heard earlier mention of this matching algorithm called Gearbox. This is actually a really, this has never been done before. I mean, I can honestly say that I've never seen anything like this. The idea behind Gearbox is that a child will come in with, who has leukemia, and if they come in at relapse, the idea is that physician that day can find out which trials that patient matches to. Not in 3 weeks, not in a month, no holding cycles of chemotherapy. That physician can go in that day and figure out which trials that patient matches to based on the data that we've been collecting the whole time. Imagine that a patient comes in at 9 in the morning, has a blood test that shows relapse, and by 3 in the afternoon, they could know which trials they match to, and there could be a concierge ready to take their call and help them get on that relapse trial. This has never been done before, and it's only going to be done if we can collect data while it's being collected for that patient. This is that high-level overview again, and I only show it because I want to make the point that central to this is a way to collect data on these children. But we don't only want to collect data on kids at relapse. We want to build the world's largest AML data commons or leukemia data commons. We want to collect data on all kids, not just the kids at relapse. We want to collect every child that's diagnosed. We want to put those data in a central place where we can have a standard way of thinking about it and looking at it, the sequencing data, the clinical data, and we want to make those data then available to researchers around the world to use for their studies of these kids. So you'll see this picture and over again, and I just want to make sure everybody understands that it's our high-level view, and we want to make sure that people understand that this is not just for relapse kids. This is for all kids with leukemia. The point of this slide is just to show you that this is a lot of hard work. This requires a lot of in-person meetings. It's a lot of slogging through what we call variables and what we give names to. This is like learning to talk or walk again. This is getting researchers in the COG and the researchers in Europe to agree on how we're going to grade different types of cancers. This is not easy work. It's expensive. It's time-consuming. It takes a team, and we're dedicated to making sure that at the end of this, we have something that we can share with the world. So everything that we do, everything that we collect will be available for researchers all over the world to use. We're right here in the middle at COG Atlanta, but we've been working on this now for 2 years already, and we've already planned out the whole next year of meetings, and the idea is to get this launched out in the middle of next year. This is just to show you our team. So we're building up our team at University of Chicago. Those of you who study data commons, I'm sure there's lots of you, know that the University of Chicago is home to the genomic data commons. And now we're on top of that infrastructure backbone. We're building the pediatric cancer data commons. This is the team. Monica and Brian are here from the U Chicago team. Monica is our program manager. Brian is our overall architect of our data infrastructure and our data models and data dictionaries. You guys should wave back there, okay? And so, this is work that's fundamental to pediatric cancer, and we're so thankful for LLS for funding this initiative. It's incredible work. I'm telling you, it's revolutionary what's being done here, and LLS is at the center of it, and we're so excited to be a part of it. So with that, I'll stop, and I'll take any questions that you have, and I know we'll have time later to chat as well. So thanks. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, what is the volume of the data? So clinical data itself we expect data on hundreds of kids ultimately, but the clinical data itself is not that big. But I want to assure you that we're not going after small data here, and I'll give you one example. So in the current way of thinking about clinical trials, if we're collecting data on cardiac function, a child has an echo, ultrasound of the heart, and then we collect one little value called an ejection fraction or a shortening fraction, and that goes into some database, one little number. I don't think that's right. I think we should collect the whole echo and the whole video and the report and everything that goes along with it. That's a lot of data all of a sudden, but we're in a position where we can collect and we can save it. Same thing with the genomic data. Why should we do an entire sequencing panel with thousands of variants and only record 3 of them? We need to collect all the data and have it available for researchers. So the volume is actually going to be quite big, but when you're talking about terabytes and petabytes of data, that's exactly what we do. We're ready to take that on, and we're excited to build that infrastructure. There's a question back here in the middle. Yeah.
Well, I guess if you're breaking down the silos that you started out your conversation with, I would assume that's going to require persuasion to get the participants to jump on board.
Yeah, so there's a carrot, there's a stick, right? So we're very much, I think the carrot model is great. You want to make sure that the easiest thing to do is the right thing to do. So if people want to put their data in a database, you need to make it easy to share, easy to standardize. So that's something we're good at. I think we're in a position now where we rely on federal agencies and granting agencies to start to require people to share data and to use data standards. I think this is an important aspect. I think the NCI, the FDA, HHS, pharma, the granting agencies, they all start to now have, we have a literacy and a culture issue. We have to start requiring people to use these terms and these sharing agreements, and we have to require that if you're going to take the money, you have to share the data. Now lots of people want to talk. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Have you guys considered blockchain to help with data governance as you connect those silos together? And
yeah, so we're very interested in the question about blockchain. We have data blockchain in every good conversation. So now we should do a startup. The question's a great one, and it's how do we ensure that we have good fidelity of the data and the protocols as it goes through the pipeline. So blockchain is a great technology that could be used to help us make sure that as the data are collected and they go through the entire pipeline and life cycle of the data, that it's unchanged and that the protocols are unchanged. Pharma is very interested in this area. We've started looking into it. There's many startups and companies in this area, and I think those technologies are going to be critical to making sure that we have something that meets all the data provenance and stewardship criteria that we set forth. Yep.
Is there an opportunity to collect data from past patients?
Yes, that's a great question. So part of our commitment to building a data commons is that we want to take the data from previous trials and get it harmonized into our data commons. Now we don't need to go back 40 years for data, but definitely from the previous COG trials, as well as working with partners at other centers like Dana-Farber or Sloan or St. Jude, and then around the world, we want to collect those data, harmonize it to our standard, and make it available as part of our initial data commons. I think we owe it to all those trials and all those kids to get those data into our data commons. Right behind you, yeah?
The data from the WashU St. Jude genomic sequencing, is that going to go into this as well?
So the question's about the data from the WashU St. Jude's project. So do you have an opinion about that?
Well, it's publicly available data, so it'll be part of it.
Yeah, so anything that's publicly available we can access. And I will say also, we've been in talks with St. Jude's already about doing some initial collaborations to share data, to share clinical data. And then we're working with groups like the Gabriella Miller Kids First Data Initiative and working with the NCI with their Cancer Research Data Commons ecosystem to try to make sure that we fit into any of the growing numbers of data commons and ecosystems out there. Yep.
Well, first, this is awesome. This is awesome. But second, so once you have, okay, you qualified for these 3 trials or whatever, what's the support engine? What comes next for these patients? Is that part of your?
Do you mean from a clinical trial?
Yeah, just from okay, so I qualify for these 3 trials, and a lot of different physicians have different opinions as to whether you should really do it, and they're not,
Right, so again, the point of setting up this platform is that every physician has access to the same data and the same resources. And I imagine that going forward, we will have things like virtual tumor boards, we'll have virtual consultation. The whole point is that so that the physician in rural Oklahoma can have the same access to resources as somebody at CHOP or at Dana-Farber. And so we want to make sure that the whole point of having a platform like this is that we can democratize access like that. Yeah, for sure.
And I'd like to add to that too, that our goal is to work with the foundations that are here to build what LLS has in terms of support and to know what you have so that we can help navigate people who need housing, travel, financial, all the other pieces to make, it's all great that there's a trial for you, but if it's hard to get to, or you don't know, you don't have the means to do it.
Or you want to do it and maybe your physician thinks that it's not sure, like,
exactly.
There should be encouragement.
That all of that, we need to know who can do what to help make it possible. And some of these may be 2 or 3 different options, right? There may be multiple options, and then you and your physician can discuss it together to say what makes sense. And if they need additional people, we've
Right,
got a
virtual boards to have the
of
opinions of other
experts who
physicians
can help.
is critical.
Yeah, we do have an online question from Katrine Erickson. What's the annual cost of the database setup and then maintenance?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, this is not cheap work, but I will make the point that the cost is not so much the infrastructure. I mean, obviously the servers and all the storage costs money, but the cost is human cost. It's hiring people to harmonize data, to build data commons, to build data models. And so all of a sudden, when you have a team that's approaching 10 people, it starts to get expensive. And so without putting actual numbers on it, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars getting into millions of dollars over time. If you want to really do this at scale and do this over multiple types of cancer and build something that's sustainable and scalable, again, if in 3 years we build something that is a siloed resource, we haven't done our job. And so to build this in a way that's really going to be expandable is the goal here, and that requires sustainable funding.
And one more from online, Holly Henley. How does what you are doing differ from other existing data commons, such as Gabrielle Miller Kids First? Are they and others sharing their data with you?
Great question. In fact, we have a FAQ on our website that has that exact question on it. So Gabrielle Emory Kids First is something we're very intimately involved with. I'm one of the investigators on the Kids First data resource. They're really changing the paradigm of how we collect and store and analyze genomic data. It's a wonderful group doing wonderful work. We are our group at UChicago is squarely in a different space. We think about how do we harmonize and share the world's clinical data. We want to build data that are connected to every other resource. I'll give you an example. We study another tumor called neuroblastoma, and we have lots of clinical data on kids with neuroblastoma. We now can connect those data to image data that we have. We can connect it to genomic data. We can collect it to sample data. Those all exist in different data resources and different data commons. And I would expect the same thing for our AML commons. If somebody puts data in the Gabriella Miller Kids First Commons for a child with AML, we will connect to those data and we will feed that commons the highest quality clinical data we have in order to optimize the analysis that can be performed. So it's a big tent. There's not going to be one commons to rule them all. We think that everybody has to work together. We have to share data, and that's the only way this is going to work. Okay, we good? Are we moving? We haven't. Julie's up next. All right.
Hi. I'm Julie Guillot. A lot of you in the room know me, but some of you don't. I am actually an AML parent, and I lost my son Zach when he was 9 to AML following 3 bone marrow transplants. And ever since, I have been really involved in doing whatever I can do to speed progress in childhood AML and now in childhood leukemias. One of the things that, and also you should know a bit about me, is there are quite a few of you like me in this audience that I don't have a medical background, but I actually have engineering by education and have been involved in IT consulting and business process reengineering. So I kind of look at things from a little bit different angle. So what I wanted to talk about today was actually partnerships. And, we've heard a lot today about LLS Pedal, LLS, Children's Initiative, but I think that I can speak on behalf of Gwen that LLS is bringing their expertise to bear, but they don't want to do this alone, nor should they do this alone, and I don't think they can do this alone. Wouldn't you say that, Gwen? And really what we want to talk about today is how we can all work together in partnership to get things done, to get things moved across the goal line. So to give you an example, and again, I don't want to say, oh, look what we've done, it's so great, but I just want to tell a story about one particular project. And that is the Target Pediatric AML project. When LLS actually started Beat AML, they weren't really ready to do it in kids. And so Michael and I are like, well, we need Beat AML in pediatrics. And so we actually started with just one simple question. Standing back from the disease, if we could get one thing done, what would that be? One thing across the goal line. And surprisingly, I didn't think the doctors could stack hands. But surprisingly, they stacked hands and they said that targets, we need more therapeutic targets, but that's going to be this massive sequencing effort. And it turned out to be target discovery was actually an $8 million chunk of work that needed to get done. And oh, by the way, we really need to sequence every child because in AML, every kid's leukemia is different. And so sequencing of every child and discovery of new targets. So what we did is basically in good old, engineering style, sat down and made a work plan. And we made a big cost estimate for what it would take to get this done. And I'm like, oh my gosh, $8 million. We didn't have a foundation. We didn't have a logo, didn't have a website, didn't have anything. All we knew is what needed to get across the finish line. And so the only thing that I knew to do was, number one, I'm nobody. So let's get the endorsement of the doctors. They all stacked hands and signed a letter and said, if we could get one thing done, this is what it would be. It's the highest potential, greatest need project. And so our initiative was endorsed. At the beginning, though, I asked them, why can't you get this done? If this is so important to you, why can't you get it done? Well, Julie, it doesn't fit into any traditional grant mechanism. It doesn't fit by size. It doesn't fit by work description. It just doesn't fit. So it's like, wow, we got this thing that it's the number one thing we got to get done, but it doesn't fit into any grant. And so what we did is really we took it, we logoed it, and we just went out and developed a set of materials, and we went out to all of you, or many of you in this room. And we just told the story about how we needed to get this done, and it's endorsed. But really what we did is we went to everybody and asked, what could you do? What could you give? And the really surprising and beautiful thing is that people were like, yeah, I think we need to get this done. Some people gave discounts. Our sequencers gave massive discounts. Some of them gave plates and chemicals. One company gave us a project video. Others gave us discounted web design. And then many others actually contributed to the project so that we actually pooled money. And we were able to pool as a posse, as a militia, $4 million. And then lo and behold, the NCI, who gets a lot of bad press, they stepped up and helped us finish the entire thing. So $8 million, raised over a matter of a couple of years with a posse. And I'd actually like to target pediatric AML funders and people in the room to actually stand up. Stand up. Actually, Malcolm should be standing too. But it made me just think about the question of, a lot of what we do, everybody in this room is doing such wonderful work, but we do things largely by grants. And to maybe think about, taking a step back from the disease and understanding what actually needs to get done. All right, target discovery. Check it, it's in progress now. Now we need master match trial. We don't have a match trial for kids with leukemia. We need to now take these targets. If we don't do anything, they're just going to sit there. They're never going to make it to the clinic. This initiative, PEDAL initiative, will take those targets and move them to clinic. And we need a data commons so that we can actually figure out which therapies, we can find the patterns and match the right therapies to the kids. So, this is just one example, this divide and conquer. So, I ask myself, just as a parent, as an advocate, it's really popular right now to demand of our researchers that they share data and they share research and they collaborate and they work together and we want them to share credit. And so I guess I stand before you today, and I know that I'm not the first, and I know this has been tried before, but I think that we have to think about us as funders. Shouldn't we be demanding the same of ourselves? Can't we need to work together as a unified body. And I think that we do a really great job in advocacy today, that we've really started. That thing is humming now. Look at the legislation's getting passed. Now we have an opportunity, I think, to work together now on research and infrastructure. And so that's really what we wanted to put forth today. And I know you're going to think this is goofy, maybe it's a little cheesy, but I think that there's a great visual that shows exactly what I'm talking about. If we can get it to go. Sound? Oh, who saw this movie? Dunkirk. Yours truly is sitting there like sobbing. Oh, we don't have the sound? Okay, we can act it out. But I remember, these kids were pinned. They were surrounded by the enemy. It was certain death. And he looks out on the horizon, and this guy says, "What do you see?" And he says, "Home." These kids were trapped with their backs against the wall. And, we tested it too. Do we think we're going to get it, or we'll just move right through it? Move through it? Okay. Well, dang it, this was like the pinnacle, the emotional part. Okay, you've got a homework assignment. You got to go and do the boat scene of Dunkirk. But what you see is all these boats coming over the horizon. It's a beautiful thing. All these kids, they're all kids, 18-year-olds. There's no escape. And he asks him what he sees.
What do you see? Home.
You see, I just have a sailboat, and Michael just has a sailboat, right? Literally. And maybe Olivia's Hope and Lolo's Angels. But American Cancer Society, you have a freaking cruise ship. In fact, you have two. And Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, you have a cruise ship. And Alex's and St. Baldrick's, they have some, frigate boats. Can you imagine if we divide and conquer, how fast we could go together? And again, not everybody can give the money, but it's like, I think if we all ask, what can we do? Because even the sailboats were able to bring a few kids home. So anyway, there you go. Shall we hit the next slide? All right. So I think that really kind of sets it up for discussion about how much faster could we go if we all work together, if we all divide and conquer. And again, I want to emphasize, and I know Gwen will say, LLS has a great deal of expertise in leukemia, and they have a lot of industry relationships with pharma companies, a lot of things they can bring to the table, but all of you have things you could bring to the table too. So just like Target Pediatric AML, man, think of what we could do. So there you go. Are there any questions? Because I feel like we need to get into conversation soon. We have 30 minutes.
Around so we don't have our backs to everyone, and then have a more informal discussion of what you heard and what you feel might be missing, what things you think are too audacious, what suggestions you have for us.
Who's point? Who's running point for the whole thing?
So, this is this is a new model for us because the exist is through the NCI and the funding through the NCI, and LLS is now has a seat at the table. So our steering committee includes members of LLS, NCI, FDA, Children's Oncology Group, and then our advisors include the thought leaders. But all of that is under the umbrella with LLS and then COG with WIC.
Okay, it's new. Give me a definition of new. Is this a year, 2 years? Pedal?
So, yeah, I'm always wrong when I estimate time.
Give me a rough idea. I'm just trying to
I'll say
understand.
2 weeks, but.
Yeah.
2 weeks? Okay.
Yeah, I'd say never
So-
a year. But no,
We want to put patients in 2020.
First on study in the second or third quarter of 2020.
So I guess I go back to this first question. Is there somebody who's pulling everything together, working at?
So Laura is our project leader.
Okay. Hi, Laura.
And Laura
That's the
has 20 years of pharma experience
There you go.
and is going to keep all of us on the straight and narrow.
On a full-time basis?
Pretty much,
For LLS or for who?
for LLS.
Beautiful.
Also project manager.
I'm sorry.
And
I
we
also
have
have
a
a
project
project
manager.
manager. 4 hours.
Pretty strong lady.
Yeah.
So obviously a big one's going to be funding, right? A lot of the agencies that are in here, and specifically LLS, have very distinct, well-known fundraising activities throughout the year. Man and Woman of the Year, Light the Night. I mean, a lot of people get behind them. They understand them. Businesses will match. You can raise a lot of money that way. But as a person who ran for Woman of the Year and raised a lot of money, I have no idea where that money went. It went to a great organization, but you could raise a lot more, I think, if you could funnel, as a participant in those areas, the money to something like this. And people that went through that walk with us as friends and families and people like that can get behind it versus just this agency that's out there that they've heard of, that maybe the money goes to where they want it to or maybe where it doesn't go. I think we got to think about how do you utilize the already existing fundraisers and help people if they have, I mean, a lot of people run in those that are, you know, parents. And so if this is an area where they want to put their money, I think you should have that choice.
Absolutely. So we have been talking exactly about that to try, so we've done that in the past with Man Woman, with some of the others, at a certain fundraising level and primarily for research programs.
Yep.
And what we have accomplished is not, so I guess the hard part is we can't do the auditing for every $50 to say, yes, that definitely went here or there. But we have now gotten to levels of fundraising either for teams or for individuals where it can be designated for, and not just for sorry guys, but not just for the Children's Initiative, for lymphoma, if that is your area of interest. You know, whatever is your passion, because that's why people participate in these, because they have a connection to the issue. And so we have that now, exactly as you say. I would like it to be less amounts of money, but I am not the fundraising side of the organization. I'm the science side of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I get it that $50 is ridiculous, but if like the person running or organizing the team is like, I'd like to funnel my total amount here, I think you should have that voice within the organization, personally.
Pardon me? Yeah, go ahead.
So with BDML asking about, that's a good question. And with the BDML trial, where we raised $125 million, we didn't do all that with donor development, but what we did with donor development brought in a lot of money. And that was a very specific campaign, and we did like the Man Woman money for that, supported the organization, but didn't go to BDML. But we did go to donors and say, if you would like to donate to BDML, 100% of your donation will go to the BDML trial. And it worked very well because we had a specific reason for donors to give. I think we're going to do the same thing with the Children's Initiative.
Good. No, I think that's really helpful, because then a lot of people want to know, then you can talk about the initiative, you can give them more context than just the, LLS is great, you have that, but at the same time, it makes people closer, they're giving sometimes a lot of money, feel closer to where the money's going.
Gwen, any thought given to how to keep this group, or even beyond this group of funders, the foundations, kind of aligned with where we are, where we're going?
Well, that's actually, I want to turn that question around back to the group, because it's easy for me to say, yeah, we'll write a blog or we'll do, post something on the website. What is the best way to keep people aware of what's going on, for you to provide us information about things you know about, that we should know about? How do we keep what's the best and least invasive way? I apologize to everyone in the room for the 27 emails that we sent this week about this meeting. I want to try and find the best way to do that. Do you have suggestions for us? What would you want to know? How often? What would be the case of it?
Could you form something that's kind of separate for coalition, leading towards that? And then another question, this might have been a question, but I'm not quite sure. So as a separate nonprofit that might not want to use the fundraising mechanism of the society, say we have our own event that we do. So are you saying that there would be a way that we could have our own event and then designate the money
As a directed donation?
Okay.
Yes. But,
Yeah, just to kind of
before we get, unless it's about communication.
No, it is about communication.
Okay, great. Then
So
that's what I want to hear.
yeah, and my wife ran for the.
That's good.
Oh, this is better.
It's hard to hear. Yeah.
Great.
Everyone hear me? Okay. So my wife ran for the Woman of the Year, and I don't know. Hello. Okay. So my wife ran for the Woman of the Year, and I could understand exactly. I don't know. I'm just going to talk loud. So my wife ran for the Woman of the Year, and I understood exactly what the steps that I needed to do to support her. I needed to have several events. I needed to send emails out. I needed to target a list of all the potential donors that we had. What I see with the LLS is that you guys have done a great job bringing leading minds and talking about progress. You guys have brilliant people who are working on this. What I don't see is a plan for how to go back to Julie's point. How do we harness people who want to get involved and harness that? And right now, the only way that you're touching the people is through donors and campaigns. There are other avenues that we have where people want to plug in. If someone feels passionate about the informatics piece, how can they help with that? You guys have a vast network of people that you touch, but you're not going to solve this just with brilliant minds. You're going to need to tap into the people that can help you. For example, on the informatics, there's been many projects done on Kaggle, and they've put solving cancer out there where the world will work on it for free. And then you guys don't need to pay brilliant people to research it. You have 10,000 people who are trying to win $10,000 for one prize to research and figure out if they can give a cure for cancer. There's got to be more ways where we can collaboratively come together, unlock all our shared skill sets, and it's got to be more than just giving money. So that's at least my take on it.
Well, one of the things that we have put in place and that we hope will be ready for prime time in October is a volunteer platform where people can actually tell us what they can do, what their skill sets are, what their connections might be, so that we could look at that and say, okay, these are some people who need to talk to Sam. These are some people who need to talk to Sohail, and try and make those connections, because doing it one at a time is incredibly inefficient. And so we have what we call VIA, which is Volunteers in Action, where you can actually, you put in some basic, how do we get in touch with you information.
Yeah.
And then we can hear what your what what your connections might be, what ideas you might have.
I
and
almost
how
think
might
what
be
you
able to do
need
it.
is you need your leaders to say, this is what I need.
Yeah.
And you need like them to have a project manager to say, here, I'm gonna go look out. Because I think tasking them and taking away them from research is the wrong decision. And I also think that they've got to define like how they want people to help them. And I think that's really what you need.
Exactly.
And then people will feel more engaged to the cause, and you probably end up raising more money anyway.
Yeah, I'm not a foundation. I'm not a doctor, far from it. But I have I think, an interesting perspective. First of all, I very much appreciate the idea of the silos and the need for a lot of clinical trials. In 1972, I was diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma. I was told I had 6 months to live. In 1970, right after that, I was asked to become involved in a clinical trial at Emory University Cancer Center, which is now the Winship Clinic. And there were 13 of us. Within 2 years, I was cancer-free. The other 12 people all died within 2 years. Shortly thereafter, that trial was ended. And I remember my doctor sharing with me his frustration that what he considered to be part of the successes of that program were never shared. That's how you make advancements. And that's why it's so important that you have these clinical trials, which are not cheap and very often do not hit the pot of gold. But them as together make such a big difference. So I understand that. I'm here because of 2 reasons. I got involved in a fundraiser with the team in training and was rather successful, so I got an invite to this. But the main reason I'm here is because my 5-year-old grandson has leukemia. And this, Julie, this is really, and your videos are so inspirational. When we were doing fundraising, I would send them out, and I want to thank you. They made a difference, and I know they've made a difference in a lot of people's lives. But you know, one of the things that is confusing to me, and I want to ask you about this because as a grandfather, I'm torn. There's Rally, there's Cure, there's St. Baldrick's, and there doesn't seem, they seem to be silo-ish in and amongst themselves. But what I will say for those organizations, and I'm going to offer constructive criticism here to LLS, is that those organizations seem to have a very much and very distinct relationship with the leukemia families that I don't sense LLS does. As an example, this past Saturday, I went with my grandson and his 2 brothers and his mom and dad to the Braves game. It was childhood cancer night. And there was a big event before the game for all these cancer patients. And every family there is actively involved in one of those organizations. And there was a lot of money raised that night through those organizations and the Atlanta Braves. Now, they talked about Cure, they talked about Rally, they talked about St. Baldrick's, they talked about Camp Sunshine, they talked about whatever the lemonade one is, I forget the name of it, and a bunch others. But there doesn't seem to me, and I've got a son and a daughter-in-law who are involved in this, there does not seem to be a connection with the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. Let me rephrase that. There is not the connection with your organization that there is with those organizations. And I think that if that can be put into place, your ability to raise funds will rise dramatically. Fundraising is all about relationships. It's all about relationships. And right now, I'm not sensing a relationship between the Leukemia Lymphoma Society and many of these families whose children are dealing with a cancer. So my suggestion to you is to look at that and to see what you can do to get involved in their world on a more personal basis. And I think that will help your world also in terms of your research through fundraising. There you go.
Do you have a suggestion?
Excuse me?
Do you have a suggestion as to
Well,
how to link the two?
I don't know how, but I mean, the second my son and his wife found out that our little Maddox, he was 4 when he was diagnosed, and the second he was diagnosed, those organizations they were contacting them. And I'm trying to be honest here. I am very supportive of this. I don't want to give the impression that I am very supportive of this. And I raised a lot of money for the Leukemia Lymphoma Society with my TNT group. But I know they get in, there's all kinds of activities for the kids, for the families. There's rarely a weekend that goes by when we don't get an invite from my son and his wife to go to some cure or rally event or something like that.
Who are the organizations?
Excuse me?
Who are these other organizations?
The two that have been the most prevalent in their household are Rally and Cure. And those were on your thing, Julie. And I guess I do have a question for you. How are all these connected? And are you going to be connected with those groups? Because there are a lot of different organizations out there. Their only mission is childhood cancer. So how are you meshing with those?
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
In response to this gentleman's question, is the purpose today how to find better fundraising for Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, or should we get it back to the PEDAL project? Because the PEDAL project is what we're here to talk about. And your points are very valid, but it's not, my understanding is this is not an LLS meeting today. It's a PEDAL project, and how can everyone in the room together come and advance the PEDAL project? Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, but let me just throw that back. The PEDAL project, if I'm understanding correctly, is funded by the LLS. Is that correct?
That's
The LLS and others, yes.
Okay. What I'm saying is the LLS could have much greater degree of funding if they, in my opinion, if they changed a few things, with the cancer patients themselves. I know when I raised money, we raised for a group running a race, we raised $50,000, which isn't a lot of money, but it was to us. But I'm going to tell you, there was hardly a person that we got a donation from that didn't ask, can we have this dedicated to the pediatric initiative? Because I would talk about the pediatric initiative, and I had to tell them all, no, we can't. And I think we could have raised a great deal more money had we been able to do that.
Can I say something?
I just want to say, your point is well taken. I think historically speaking, the LLS as being protecting itself as for the adults. But as Gwen said at the beginning, it was funded by the family. We're going back to the source and the origin of the LLS. So LLS is not St. Jude. I get letters from St. Jude and MD Anderson practically every month. I haven't got one from the LLS yet, but that does not mean that we shouldn't be starting the infrastructure to create this trial. LLS is the only one who's done it with BDML. None of the others you're mentioning is having a study of this scope.
No,
with this goal. So
Yeah,
your point
well-
is extremely well taken. LLS is the new kid on the block in the pediatric arena, so to speak, for fundraising. And we take that point well taken and we'll fill that gap. I'm a scientist, I'm doing the technical component. But I think that you have a good point in terms of the gap. But today, we are here to talk about this trial and the entire infrastructure, which is being on my shoulders for the past year. It's huge. It's never done before and unprecedented. And so it requires an unprecedented fleet of little boats to get these kids through the home. And that's why we're here, because alone we can't do it. Normal ways we can't do it, and it will require an unprecedented effort.
So I just add one more thing, is that this doesn't get to your question about the families and the foundations, but from a funding point of view, the foundations know what's going on. I'm getting texts and tweets from other foundations saying, I'm watching you, we want to help with this initiative. Rally's been very generous with us, St. Baldrick's has been generous. We've been very lucky to get funding from different sources, all in the name of helping support LLS Pedal.
That was one of my main questions. How do all these organizations, do they communicate, do they work together?
Because
or they
Rally made a beautiful donation along the scale that you're talking about that you raised, which went to support a developer to build some of the infrastructure that's fundamental to this commons that we're building. So
how is this project team held accountable for, if I'm a foundation, which I'm not, and I write a check for the Children's Initiative, how is this team going to be held accountable for the results that you claim to be able to generate as a result of the project?
I can say locally for my group, we're being held accountable with milestones and with reports and with timelines, and it's, we have a full-time program manager that I introduced, and so from a PM perspective, we're being held very accountable locally. How we're being held accountable at the broad scale is going to have to do with outcomes, and I'll let Andy and Gwen address that. I mean, there has to be that kind of accountability.
And it would seem like then that has to somehow, it may already be being done, but it seems like that accountability needs to be communicated out to the foundations on either a monthly, quarterly, some kind of a basis where we have a cadence that the people who are involved in it and supporting it know what's going on.
That's exactly my question. What kind of cadence would people want to have? We don't want to torment you with information that you don't want to have, but we also want to say, this is slower, here's our timeline, here's what we've gotten accomplished. And, do we make it as needed? Do we make it, we put it somewhere and you go to it when you want to? This is exactly what I want to hear. So
Gwen, maybe just two basics for the funders in the rooms. What is the target for fundraising? And then just as Laura is kind of the trail boss around the actual progress, who's the trail boss on funding?
Well, the trail boss on funding is Robin Plotsker, and our estimate, and we just hired a contract research organization, and we don't know how Pharma will contribute and others, but to get the basics of what we've talked about is about a $50 million ask.
Okay.
You've had your hand raised for a while.
Yeah, so I want to ask a question, but I want to address you in terms of from the foundational standpoint. There are a good deal of foundations here that I think we could certainly talk to you about how everybody connects in various different manners. I'd be happy to do that. My question to you guys is, what, if any, buy-in from pharma is there at this point?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the largest funder of cancer research in the country is pharma, right? So we need them at the table. we had a strategy forum in Utrecht last year in April, this past year in April, and I think there were 30 pharmaceutical partners represented. The FDA was there, PDCO, part of the European Medicines Agency, was there, and AML, pediatric AML, was the focus of that discussion. From that, as part of that meeting, we reviewed the pipelines, the pharma pipelines, and the drugs that they're interested in moving forward. We reviewed our target wish list on the academic side, the drugs that we want to move forward. And Sohail and his group have done a lot more since then to identify even newer targets. We have 5 companies that we're moving forward with now. Not every company's got drugs that we're interested in. We've got a couple companies that are, because of regulatory requirements, are very interested in working with us, but they're sort of lower priority targets. But I think we have buy-in for 2 of our largest cohorts to start in 2020. And that's a big deal for the individual site. We don't expect to open this at 10 sites and hope everybody's going to travel to those 10 sites. Children with relapse leukemia often aren't able to travel. We want to open this at 150, 200 sites in the United States. And to do that, we need to make sure that the sites are incentivized to open it because because they have a likelihood of enrolling a child on those trials. And so we're starting with the broadly targeted, and we're moving more and more narrow. I think we have the broadly targeted area covered, and now we're moving into some of the more rare molecular subsets. So to answer your question, I think that what pharma likes about this is centralized screening. There's no way to do an industry-sponsored study where you're going to screen 100 kids and hope to enroll 10 on the trial. They love the fact that we're going global, that we're including the EMA in this. That takes a lot of pressure off of them with their European development. And they like the fact that this is a hybrid partnership that includes some of the efficiencies that we can get through partnering with the NCI, central IRB, single contract mechanism. So there has been a lot of enthusiasm from pharma.
Has there been any pushback?
There's always pushback from specific companies that want control over the development of their drug. If they have a high-value asset that is being moved forward in adults, they want to maintain control over the pediatric development. Fortunately, there's not been pushback from the companies that we've wanted to work with most.
And I think that once those trials get going and once they're successful, in my view, the other pharmaceutical companies are gonna jump in.
More courageous.
Once they see that we're able to deliver them what they need for regulatory purposes, then they're gonna start jumping on and using this mechanism and all the advantages that Andy.
I think that goes back to the deliverables question. If we don't do this right, we're not going to get drugs, right?
Yeah.
So for us to do this right, we're going to know we did it right because pharmaceutical companies are going to recognize that we can do it better, cheaper, faster, and if we're successful, they'll be lined up.
We have some questions from the
Yeah,
table.
and let me just say that,
We can run a little bit over.
hold on. But they're gonna have to transform this whole room, so we don't have a lot of wiggle room. In the next session, though, we're gonna have time for more questions, yes or no?
Sure, and please, we want to.
I just want to say one thing quickly. I just have a quick question, because I even want to get an idea in my head, and I'm a real layman, but I appreciate everybody that's come here, because we lost our child to AML 23 years ago from M7, and so I'm really excited to hear all of this that's going on, and I want to keep this group together, which I think is your goal, Julie, to keep all the parents and people and interested foundations and all that together somehow. That's what you're trying to get, is a communication venue or whatever. So whatever that would work, I don't know, there's a lot more work to be done, I understand that. But like you're saying, so we're not replicating efforts in foundations, we can all work together. Maybe it's setting up some kind of a a smaller group that you guys can all work together, how to put some.
Portal.
A portal. A portal.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Credit.
That's my 2 cents, because it's been 23 years and this is starting to happen, and we want to keep all these great energies together, and I think that's what you're aiming to do.
Yeah, and my hope, just as a parent, as a
Yeah.
person who's outside of this, is that I know that there are a lot of consortiums and that sort of thing, but when it comes to leukemia, maybe that we begin to toss this idea around in our head that, could there be something called like a pedal alliance? And it's nothing formal, but that when it comes to leukemia, that we're going to begin to think of each other. So when American Cancer Society is thinking about leukemia, they're thinking about, hey, we probably need to call Gwen. And also, too, the whole reason for this was actually to get people in the room, to meet each other, so that, we can continue the dialogue. But, I'm hoping that, and I understand it's a very short time frame, and I apologize, for the meeting format. But let me just do one thing. Introduce Robin Plonsker, and she kind of handles foundation relationships for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And if I could propose, look, we've got a whole evening ahead of us, but maybe I can propose that, if we're going to be following up with everybody here, and maybe what we can do is kind of deep dive with you, and then you will be able to have, a lot of questions. I'm sure you have questions. But then to ask, is there maybe something here that aligns with our mission, that we could team up on? But I mean, maybe that's the way, I would think about leaving this. If you're okay, with us continuing the conversation with you to reach out. And then maybe what we can do is then, again, maybe get together virtually online, kind of have a debrief of what what were the key questions that everybody had, and this is what everybody kind of came up with. But and maybe in the future there'll be. I really dream that in leukemia we can meet every year and strategize and say, all right, man, we got the data commons done, great. The master trial's in process. We've got these 5 targets we want to get across the finish line this year, and then maybe we can kind of set some priorities every year and just. I'm sorry, I'm from Texas. I'm thinking about skeet shooting. Just bam, boom, bam. Knock them out of the sky. So is that? I apologize that we have to kind of continue the conversation outside the room because they have to switch it over. But hopefully everybody will keep talking and we'll keep it rolling.
Our goal.
What's that? In charge of communication.
And ladies and gentlemen, this will conclude the afternoon session. I do want to let you know that as you depart the room, the hotel staff will be resetting this room for tonight's program. Please be sure to take all of your personal belongings and all of your Children's Initiative working session material